All right. Oh, we're in Corinthians and starting in chapter 10. And, Paul's in a real conundrum here, right? This is a real bad situation for him. He knows that if he comes to them and speaks to them in person, that if he confronts them in this, he knows that there's a good chance that he will divide the church. I think that's what he sees in this. He knows if he writes to them, if they correct what is going on, then internally within the congregation, that he feels like that would be the right way. Paul knows that if he comes and confronts them to their face and really gets bold with them to their face, that he knows that that's going to be a problem. He knows that it's going to cause dissent, that it could split the church. Paul doesn't want that. Paul knows there's people in this church that are causing problems. As we get further into this, some of those problems will start to become evident. But Paul also knows that he's not always there. He knows he started that church. He knows that church. He did a lot with that church. But Paul also knows that, he's not always going to be there, right? Problems need to be worked out internally. And if they're not, then there's going to be a split here, because he's got people here that are teaching different things than what he taught, and they're challenging his authority. It's hard to defend yourself when you're not there. It really is, and Paul understands that. So what Paul has to do is convince them that what he taught them is the truth originally, that he has authority to teach them that, and that others that come in that challenge the authority that he has are wrong. And that's really hard to do. People can be swayed a lot of different ways. People are I shouldn't use the word gullible, but that's probably the best word. People can be very gullible, right? Can be very much led into what they want to believe. And the only way we can defeat that is by teaching a truth that doesn't change. That's what Paul has to convince them of, is that the truth he taught originally is still the same truth. Because the only way to keep us from being led astray is to hold on and anchor ourselves in the things that we know to be true. In all aspects of our life, this is the case. We have to anchor ourselves in this truth and in trust and faith of one another. If we don't do that, then we'll be carried away. Paul understands that he needs to do this without him being there. Once he shows up, once he confronts them to their face, it's going to be a fight. You see, he doesn't need that. So this is his way of trying to argue his apostleship and his authority, and to try to get them to look back upon what they know to be true, and to try to bring them together and have them resolve this within themselves, and not with him having to come down and try to do it, because he doesn't desire that. There's a lesson in all this, big lessons in this for us, in conflict resolution. How do we resolve conflict in our relationships and in the church? So there's a lot of lesson in this, what he says, and in the way people perceive authority. Authority is a perception, right? Why do we accept authority from someone? I mean, what gives somebody authority, in our lives? What gives a policeman authority? He's no different than any of us, right? Do you think there's a policeman that doesn't break the law? Right? What gives him authority? We let them have authority, right? We have why? Because we were taught from the time we were young children, we were taught, hopefully, we were taught what? To respect authority, respect people in authority, right? And that carries with us throughout our life, doesn't it? We have that respect. And that's good and bad sometimes, right? Because it depends on what kind of authority we were taught to respect and how we're taught to respect that authority, right? But in other words, a policeman he's no better than anybody. He's no smarter than anybody. He definitely breaks the law like everybody else does. Like, you can't convince me they don't, right? So they definitely do that, right? And you could say, well, I have respect for them because they carry a gun. I have respect for them because they could punish me if I don't do what they say to do, right? But I think it goes a little beyond that, don't you? I think that I respect someone because I what? I respect the law that they're upholding. I don't really respect them, and it's not necessarily them, right? I mean, they're not necessarily the best person. I don't know their heart, or I don't know anything about them. They could be a corrupt cop for all I know, right? I don't know, right? They could be taking payments on the side. Maybe they work for the mob. I don't know, right? But I respect the law that they uphold. I respect our government. I respect the law of our government. I respect the law that they uphold. And as an ambassador of that law, because isn't that really what they are? As an ambassador of that law, then therefore I offer them a degree of respect. And even if I don't respect them as a person, as an individual, which I've known policemen I really don't respect as individuals, and I know policemen that I respect greatly as individuals, so let me qualify that, right? Because they're people like everybody else. But I do respect, even if I don't respect that person, don't respect that policeman, that officer, I still respect what he represents. I still respect that law. Does that make any sense? Preachers, ministers, elders, it can be the same way. I mean, even though you might not respect the person, you really need to respect the law. You need to respect what they represent, because as a minister, I'm a representative. When I speak to you and I stand here, I'm a representative of Christ. And that's really my authority. My authority is not me. I mean, does this make any sense, what I'm trying to tell you? That policeman has no authority in himself. And does that make any sense? He has no authority within himself, right? Why does he have authority? Because he puts that uniform on, he puts that badge on, and he represents the law of the United States, or the law of your city or your state. The authority that he has is not him. He has no authority except what's been given him. Does that make any sense? And as a minister of the gospel, or a minister of Christ, I have no authority. I can't preach to you a different gospel or a different Christ, because if I do that, the authority becomes vested in me, not in Christ. I have to represent Christ, have to represent the truth. And that's what Paul's trying to get them to see, is that Paul says, my apostle, and I guess I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but Paul says, this apostleship is from Christ, you see? In other words, let's get a little further. So we walk in the flesh, Paul says, we looked at this last week, we don't war. His weapons, he says, are not fleshly. And that's because he doesn't want a battle. He doesn't want a conflict. Fleshly war, fleshly battle is conflict. It's physical, right? Paul doesn't want that, because Paul understands that if it comes to a physical battle, everything's going to blow up. The church is going to split. Everything's going to go crazy, because that's what's going to happen. Paul doesn't desire that. Paul says the weapons here have to be spiritual weapons, not physical. We're destroying speculations, every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. You see, he puts that authority back on God. We are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. See, Paul is redirecting. You see, he's redirecting. In other words, these people are coming in, and these people are misleading, but Paul's wanting them to go back to this Christ, go back to God, Go back to where the authority actually comes from. And that's what you have to do. We have to ground ourselves, root ourselves in a truth. And when we do that, we have to always go back to that truth and hold everything up against it. You can't, otherwise, we just continue to drift further and further away from where we're supposed to be. Paul says we're ready to punish disobedience whenever your obedience is complete. Now, the reason he says this is because they're getting carried off as a group into this other, whatever this is, which we'll talk about a little bit. They're getting carried off as a group. Paul says, until you get obedience, until some of you come back, until you start to challenge what's going on here, there's really not much I can do. You've got to come back. Some of you have got to come back. You've got to start looking back to what you know to be true, because you're looking at it outwardly. You're not looking at the deeper truth. You're not looking past it. You're looking outwardly. You're looking at your confidence, not at Christ. You're looking at yourself, not as Jesus. And when you do that, then we continue to drift further because we're not coming back, you see, to that original truth that we know. Even if I boast somewhat further about our authority, Paul using the word "our" here, probably talking about Timothy, probably talking about Barnabas, probably talking about Apollos, maybe talking about the other apostles, which the Lord gave you, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be put to shame. So he says, the confidence I have was what the Lord gave, not what I gave, to build you up, not to tear you down. And yet you have drifted away from this because you've been led astray from this. For I do not wish to seem as if I would terrify you more by my letters. For they say his letters are weighty. And this is where Paul, he is, it's kind of funny because I don't really know where we get all this, but everybody said Paul was a little short, bald guy. Paul was not an impressive man at all. Not impressive to look at, not a striking figure. And Paul kind of alludes to that here. His personal presence is unimpressive. Apollos was eloquent, right? The Bible says Apollos was an eloquent speaker. Paul says he's a contemptible speaker. Paul says he's better at writing than he is at speaking. And I can understand that. So Paul says, you say, oh, well, his letters are powerful, but when he gets here, he's just not that impressive of a guy, right? Not nothing to really set you back. But Paul says, but let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters when absent, we're also in deed when present. In other words, Paul says, I might not be impressive to look at, and I might not have the best speech, but what I write to you is how I live. My words and my deeds match one another. I am what I say that I am. And that's important. Paul wants them to understand that the words he speaks are the truth, and that he lives by what he speaks, that they need to put that together and judge him, not just by maybe when they see him or maybe by his speech, but they need to judge him by his deed and by his word, not by his appearance or his speech. And that's what he's trying to tell them. He need to look past that. If you ever get took by somebody, generally it's by somebody that speaks good, looks good, acts good, talks good, walks good, right? There's a little bit of truth in what Paul says, right? Paul says, whoever's bewitching you here, whoever's leading you off, these are probably good speakers. They're probably eloquent. They probably know how to They're salesmen, right? They know how to lead you astray. They know how to tell you what you want to hear. They know how to, you like the way they look, you like the way they walk. They look the part, walk the part, act the part, and yet they're teaching you, they're not teaching you truth. They're leading you astray. But you're taken in because they're good salesmen, right? I mean, isn't that who gets us? I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I've been taken a few times in my life. I'm old enough to admit it, right? And you know, the truth is that every time I got took, it was by somebody who gave me who talked me into it, right? I mean, I got the spiel and I bit it and wished I hadn't have, right? So Paul's trying to tell them that, right? These guys may look better than me, they talk better than me, but you need to look beyond that. You need to look beyond physical appearance. You need to look beyond speech. You need to look beyond those things and try to look for a deeper truth, a deeper understanding, a deeper meaning. He says we're not to compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. Well, that's kind of what he's doing. But when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are without understanding. We will not boast beyond our measure, but within the measure of the sphere which God appointed to us as a measure, to reach even as far as you. In other words, when those people commend themselves, when they're measuring themselves by themselves, they're measuring themselves by what they think's right, by what they do, not by what God says, not by what God's measuring to, but what they do. They're leading them astray. The truth is that some people who lead you astray, especially I think religiously, that lead us astray, they totally believe they're right. I mean, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt their sincerity. I never have. I believe you can be sincerely wrong. I've been sincerely wrong many times in my life. Ask my wife. She'll tell you, right? You know, because I argue all the time that I'm right, and then she shows me I'm wrong. So you know, I've been sincerely wrong a lot. And I think we can be sincerely wrong. And I sincerely hope we're not. But, you know, we have to have that truth we go back to, and that's what Paul's trying to tell them. Emotion is not a good sense of truth or honesty. Emotions can be misleading. Our desire, our lust, our wants can lead us to where we don't need to go. At some point, we have to have an intellect. We have to have a logic. We have to have a faith and a truth that roots us and grounds us in where we're supposed to be. And if we don't have that, then we're going to drift away. Everything else will fade, right? And I think that's something that we have to really think about and consider in our lives, is what's that truth, you know, that we hold on to. We're not overextending ourselves. We not did reach you. We're the first to come with you, even as far as you in the gospel of Christ. Not boasting beyond our measure, that is in other men's labors, with the hope that your faith grows. We will be within our sphere enlarged even more by you. Paul's not 100% beating him down here. He is, but more than beating him down, as you can see, Paul's walking a fine line about what's wrong, and then also about having some confidence that they have the ability to go back to where they were. Paul is placing some faith in people in that congregation that they have the ability to move back to the place where they were with Paul. He's putting some faith in them here. Faith in their ability. Not in his ability or God's ability, but in their ability to go back to where they were. Paul has to have faith that they're able to resolve this within their own congregation. They're able to move back to where they need to be and away from this false teaching. And Paul in that says that he has to have some faith that what he taught them, that what they know is going to lead them back to where they need to be. Paul knows this is such a fine line. He doesn't want to totally offend them. He doesn't want to drive them away. He doesn't want to divide them. He wants them on their own to come back to where they need to be and to come back to the truth and the words that Paul's taught them. And that's hard to do, because he knows if he gets too harsh and too hard and too in their face, that it's just going to split things apart. This is a fine line that Paul's walking, because he loves them, because he cares about them. And when you read this letter, this chapter 10 to the end, however you want to take it, when you read that, I never read it that way my whole life, but now I see it. I see what Paul's trying to do. And it's funny because I read all these commentaries on this, and I read like 4 commentaries this morning on 10 and 11. And the funny thing is that I didn't agree with any of them. I read Matthew Henry, and I read Werbs, and I read NAC, and I read about 4 commentaries this morning on this. And at the end of it, I didn't agree with any of them. I'm just like, you guys don't see this. I think the way Paul, they pick it apart so hard, and they miss the heart of the message. They miss what Paul's trying to do here. And I think it's easy for us to miss it. This balance, this line that he's walking, this faith that he has in certain people there that he knows, because he knows these people. He knows them. And he knows there's people in this group that can bring this back together if they will. And I think, who do we rely on? Who do we rely on to have that ability, to have that, the knowledge and the ability to bring us to where we need to be? That we recognize them, not because of them, because the authority that they have through the gospel of Christ. Because if we boast, we should boast in the Lord, you see. Not in one another, not in our ability, not in anything that we have. Every battle we win, every soul we win, every battle we win is for God. It's not me, it's not you, it's for the Lord. We win for the Lord. And when we lose, and that's what kills me, that's why I die inside. When we lose for the Lord. You see, Paul understands that if he wins here, it's a win for everybody. He can boast in. They're not going to split. They're going to come back. You see? But Paul also understands that if he loses, then he loses for the Lord. Paul knows he feels it personally, but the gain of the loss, the boasting, is not his. It's God's. Doesn't mean we don't feel it, because we feel it. We feel it personally, but at the end of the day, we either gain or we lose for God. It's not us. You see, the battle's not really, it's beyond us. And I think that's why Paul feels how he does. He wants to win here. And as much as he wants it, much as he desires it, much as it's driving him, he knows that he's a word away, he's a confrontation away from losing it all. And that is a terrible place to be. That's a terrible place to be. You never want to be there, right? See, I don't think it's the giving. That's how come I don't think 10 through 13 go with basically 1 through 9. Because, we looked at 1 through 9, and you can tell this is a whole different level right here. This is a big shift. It's a fundamental shift. You're not going to write this to somebody that you're trying to get to give you money. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? I don't know why they'd be divided over the money given part, because, he's not commanding them to give. He's wanting them to give. He's asking them to give. He's giving them reasons to give, but he's not commanding them to do it. If you get a little deeper, when we get a little deeper in this, I think you'll see who these people are in some of this division. But, as we get, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but as we get a little more into this, I almost think part of this division here is because they got guys here that are making, this is just me. I looked at this about 4 times this morning, and I was trying to think, as you get a little further, maybe I can make the case. I don't know, but I think part of the problem with these people who were coming in here and dividing them is that they were making a living off of this congregation. And I think that they were swaying people to get more money from this congregation given to them. I think they were getting support. I'm going to try to make this case a little bit. I could totally be wrong about this. But I think when Paul alludes to some of this stuff later on, I get the idea that this was very money driven. Whatever's going on here was financially driven to a large extent. These were guys who were leading them astray to make their living, to make their profit from these people. They were telling them what they wanted to hear. They were making money from this congregation. That's just my opinion. I mean, I'll try to argue this a little bit and we get a little further. Like I said, I read a bunch of commentaries on this, and at the end of the day, I'm just like, I don't agree with hardly anything you guys are saying, which, I mean, I guess that's all right. They're supposed to be a lot smarter than me, but boy, sometimes when I read commentaries, I'll walk away shaking my head. So it's kind of funny because, which I'm kind of getting off again, but a lot of these commentaries, it's kind of like they read off each other. You know what I mean? Like you read one commentary and you read another one and you're kind of like, yeah, I think this guy read this guy, and they all kind of get on the same. It's like you can read them and they all kind of follow the same line of thought. And you're like, where's the guy out here that's not thinking like all these guys are thinking, because these guys are all thinking the same way. And I can read 10 of these and they all say the same thing. And I'm kind of looking for that guy who's looking the other direction a little bit, and I have a hard time finding that sometimes. And then when I get ready to teach it, I'm like, why is my mind not going the way their mind's going here? Am I wrong or are they wrong or are we both wrong? I don't know, but we're not going in the same way, here. Well, they are a lot. It is a lot like-minded. Yeah, it is. They are pretty like-minded. Yeah. Yeah, I think you got to be careful. I have people that, and I'm that, when you buy Bibles, a lot of you probably have, or a lot of people buy study Bibles. And, basically a study Bible is Bibles that basically take these commentaries and put them at the bottom of the page. And, that's all good. And I mean, I learn a lot from commentaries, don't get me wrong. And there's a lot of good stuff there. But, what you got to understand if you have a study Bible is that the words at the bottom of the page, that's a man's words at the end of the day. You know what I'm saying? It's not God's words, And I mean, it helps you think, and I'm not saying it's all wrong, but I'm just saying at the end of the day, you need to remember those words at the bottom of that page in that study Bible, they're not God's. That's not God's word. That's man's word, And we need to understand, you need to draw that line sometimes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It can definitely work against what you see, and I like that. I mean, I like looking at differing opinions. I'm a big guy on looking at whatever somebody that doesn't believe me believes. I firmly believe in that, but at the same time, I think you have to discern for yourself, and I think it's not let somebody else necessarily tell you what's being said, because any commentator on earth has a bias, an agenda, you understand what they're selling too, don't get me wrong, they've all got a bias. Like I have a bias. I mean, I'm not saying I don't, absolutely. We all do. So, you kind of got to be careful. Paul really gets sarcastic at the beginning of 11, and this is true Paul right here. I mean, to me, this is true Paul writing right here, because Paul's a very sarcastic guy, and that's one reason when I read Hebrews, maybe Paul wrote Hebrews. I mean, they said he did. I mean, it was that way for centuries, and then all of a sudden we decided he didn't. But I'm not saying he did or he didn't, but one thing when I read Hebrews, and that's one thing I don't see Paul. I mean, there's places in Hebrews I kind of see Paul, but that sarcasm's just not in the book of Hebrews. In just about every letter Paul writes, it seems like you have this sarcastic undertone, and it's no different here. He says, I wish you could bear with a little foolishness, but indeed you're bearing with me, for I'm jealous with a godly jealousy. When you get down, we'll get down to 4, you'll see what I'm talking about. For I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. Paul says, I didn't betroth you to me. I betrothed you to Christ. Remember at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul says, some of you say I'm Paul, some say I'm Apollos, right? And he says you can't build a foundation other than any other foundation, which is Jesus Christ, and each man builds on that foundation, 1 Corinthians 3. I almost think this kind of refers back to that same thought. You're building yourself up on men, not on Christ. You're building yourself up on these false teachers, these false men, and you're not building yourself up on Christ. And if you're leaning towards them and you're going away from Christ and you're no longer a virgin, you become an adulteress. You've adulterated yourself. For I'm afraid as a serpent deceived Eve, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. See, he says these men are deceivers. That's what Satan is. Satan's the deceiver. He deceived Eve. And Paul brings it all the way back to the garden. Paul says, I'm afraid that as Eve deceived you, these men will deceive you. They'll carry you away by a false teaching. And they'll carry you away and they'll gradually drift you away from what you know to be true. Because, Paul says in 4, if anyone preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or receive a different spirit than you have not received, or a different gospel, you bear this beautifully. That's the sarcasm, okay? In other words, it's a sarcastic remark. He's saying you're falling away. You're falling off into it. You're beautifully wrong, right? And that's Paul. I mean, that's pure Paul. I don't think there's much better purity of what Paul writes than you get to 4, because he has this sarcastic tone. I mean, you see it throughout Paul's writings, but he's really throwing it in their face. You're being led astray. You're being led astray beautifully. You're beautifully wrong, right? Why? Because they're deceived, and deception happens gradually over time, right? It's just a gradual carrying away of what's true. He says, I don't consider myself in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. Now Paul holds up his authority by God. God called me to be apostle, right? In other words, these guys don't have the authority. I mean, they might make you think they do, but they don't, because their authority is coming from within themselves. What they want to believe, what you want to believe. It's not coming from God. Paul then, after he gives them this big sarcastic remark about how you're beautifully being carried away, you bear it beautifully. In other words, you're getting all this different stuff, and hey, you're just going right along with it, right? I mean, you're just falling right in, right? And now he says, but now, consider this. I am an apostle, right? I have authority. These guys, their authority is within themselves. I have authority. And the way they have authority is because they're teaching you another Jesus, another gospel. Their authority is not pure. Their authority is wrong. Their authority is false. And because of that, they're false. I'm an apostle of God. You're being led away. You're beautifully being led away, right? You're swallowing this thing. You're buying right in, and you need to back up. I love Paul's sarcasm sometimes. I'm a little sarcastic, so I kind of love Paul's sarcasm sometimes. Are there any comments? Boy, I've been talking a lot. Whew. Yeah. Well, he says a different Jesus, and he says a different spirit, and he says a different gospel. So, but he also says that they're deceiving, which means they're like Eve, like the serpent deceived Eve. So they're basically like just gradually moving them away from the truth of who Christ really is, whether they're saying Christ isn't really the Son of God, or Christ is, the gospel is different. I mean, they're they're not necessarily totally changing it, but they're deceptive. They're going away from the truth in a way that people almost don't notice, like an imperceptible shift in what's right and what's wrong. But I think the end result of what they're doing is they're trying to undermine Paul by saying his gospel, his Jesus, this isn't right. And they're trying to give themselves authority by saying, well, this is right. So they're really trying to put themselves in a position of power like they know the truth, and Paul wasn't really teaching them the truth. And that's why Paul keeps bringing them back to his authority. I don't know exactly what they were saying. There's no way we can know that. But basically, I think this is really, in the end of this, and I think we'll get there, not going to get there today, well, we're almost there. I think it's really a lot of this is getting down to this idea that if they swing it to their way, put the authority in them, people are going to start to pay them to support them. And Paul is really going to get into this in a minute, how Paul says, I didn't take money from you, which leads me to think on the opposite, that these people are taking money from them. They're using Christ, using God for their advantage, not to really preach the gospel, but for their advantage, to lift them up, to get them finances, to support them. And Paul says, as we get into next week, is going to hold up that comparison and say, but I didn't take money from you. I didn't ask for support from you, which leads me to flip it and say, well, they are, right? So we'll get more into that next week, but it's very interesting. I spent quite a bit of time looking at this, actually. So, yeah, thanks for your time this morning. Marley Moo. What? Huh? Oh. What's up, boy?